This is brought to you by Hit Wicket, the cricket game that has playing and strategy all in your pocket. There is an incredible debate to be had over who is the best spinner of all time. The two most obvious choices in Test cricket are Shayan Warne and Muttiah Muralitharan. I mean, pick your fighter. You can look at Murali's wickets per test, or the incredible workload he had, or how Warne was a genius on wickets not really set up for him. But it doesn't matter who you choose, because when it comes down to it, these are the two you're going to choose from. There's no real debate that anyone else is on their level. But maybe the better discussion is who is next best. It was Sam Allard from TalkSport who asked me this, and it broke my brain. If you like a lot of wickets at a great average, then R. Ashwin is your obvious choice. There are people from the 80s who will still say that Abdul Qadir, who bowled in probably the worst era ever for spinners, was genuinely the third best spinner of all time. But how do you compare either of those two bowlers to Alvakonda, who bowled in an era of incredibly flat wickets, and he did it a lot? What about Nathan Lyon, an off-spinner who plays his games in Australia, which was previously thought to be illegal? What about Lance Gibbs, or Hugh Tayfield, or Jim Laker? There's also Clary Grimmett, who could confuse the Don with his googlies. And you could name a few more. And for the purposes of this, we're not even going to think about Sydney Barnes as a spinner. We're just going to ignore him altogether. So I think working out who is the third choice Test spinner of all times is a lot like looking for the second best batter ever. There are many candidates, but really, it is about personal choice. And you have to account for DRS, LBW laws, and the various types of surfaces, uncovered, spin, seam-friendly, and flat. And it might be easier to handle a delivery from Bisham Bedi on the fifth day than actually work out who is the third best Test spinner of all time. If you love cricket on a deep spiritual level and want to be involved when no matches are being played, we have the game for you. Hit Wicket is so good that Harsha Bhogle and me have backed it. And that's a lot of nerd energy behind one game. This is a strategic game of cricket, and it's not just about whacking the screen really, really hard with your finger. This isn't a game where you swipe all around to try and hit the ball. You work out what works best based on real-life cricket situations. For instance, dot balls bring pressure, ones and twos lead to fours. There is no way you can just hit a six every ball or take wickets all the time. This is proper cricket, yet it still has some special gaming powers in there as well. And so this game is about playing, but also building and managing your team. You are the batter, bowler, owner, coach, captain. It's your dream, right? And there are no ads, it's just cricket. Download Hit Wicket now and bring out the cricket legend in you, because Hit Wicket is a cricket game made for you and supported by other cricket nerds. Stick it in your pocket today. Until the 1880s, spin was more effective than pace in terms of bowling average. The first time we see pace do better was the 1890s. In those days, though, the quicks kind of also bowled spin as well, so the classifications are a little bit murky. Both bowling types average about the same in the 1920s. Australia and the world's best bowlers in this period were mostly spinners. However, tweakers do not average less than pacers in any decade since the start of the 1940s. And the big change that happened really is uncovered wickets and, of course, pitches getting flatter and harder. When teams didn't cover their pitches, finger spinners reigned in and out of Asia. But as England, the last holdout, start to cover their pitches from the 1960s onwards, the spinners do drop off on non-Asian pitches. However, they keep taking wickets. Lance Gibbs was the first spinner and the second bowler after Fred Truman to take more than 300 wickets, and he did that on West Indian pitches, which sometimes spin and sometimes don't. Warne, Lyon and Vittori all take a load as well, but we do see more of the Asian spinners start to dominate. In total, we have 7 spinners in the 400 club. Lyon and Ashwin have more than 500, but going past Kumble's wicket tally may not be that easy for them. Laker and Grimmett are the two non-Asian spinners who average less than 25, while Warne is at 25.41. Naturally, 3 subcontinental spinners have a sub-25 average: Murali, Ashwin and Jadeja. Tony Locke, Derek Underwood, Hugh Tayfield and Richie Benaud round out the rest of the best spinners when it comes to averages. Murali, however, takes more than 6 wickets per game, the most by a spinner with 150 victims. Laker does pick up more than 4 wickets, but isn't an outlier here like he is with average. Yasir Shah and Syed Ajmal also take more than 5 wickets per test, but average 31 and 28 respectively. Ashwin and Grimmett take more wickets while going at a significantly lower average. Warne, Harath and Kumble all have vastly differing averages, but they're roughly the same when it comes to wickets, 4.5 per match. Varun, who works with us, came up with another metric to assess all these spinners. The geometric mean of the inverse of average, because a lower mark is better, and wickets per match. Essentially, the higher that you measure on this, the more effective a bowler is in terms of average and wickets per game. Murali is the only one above 0.5, while at the other end of the graph we see Shastri at 0.21, which makes sense because he was not a frontline bowler. Workload is another important factor while judging the value of a player. How many deliveries do they send per game? Grimmett was way ahead of anyone else because the little man took a long time to make it to Test cricket, and when he did, he offered to bowl all the overs. So far we have gone through the numbers at a surface level, but we cannot underestimate the importance of conditions in Test cricket. Where does the spinner play their games? Where do they perform at their best? And are they a first inning specialist or a destroyer in the fourth? I know this chart looks a little bit like a unicorn puked a rainbow right at you, but humour me for a moment. If we break it down, there's some really interesting patterns here. These two players did not play in the same era or on similar pitches, but they follow almost the exact same pattern. Their numbers hold up all the way through the game. Laker actually has a lower average throughout, but they're just both high quality spinners with incredible consistency. Kumble largely follows what we expect. Pretty respectable throughout the first 3 innings, and then he becomes great in the fourth. Lyon's more interesting. He starts off decently and then becomes slightly worse in the second and then improves a lot in the third, only to become slightly worse again in the fourth. It's a very weird trend that he's had. We actually made an entire video about this. Because of that, he's immune to the fourth innings boost that most spinners seem to get. And of course, that is when side spin means more and Lyon's overspin is not as important. These two follow very different trajectories. Gibbs' first innings average is 40, whereas Grimmett is 25. But both merge in the second with an average of 29, and the third with 23. And then they go their own ways in the fourth, where Gibbs' average goes up over 27, whereas Grimmett drops all the way down to 15.77. And it does make you wonder whether the thing that stops Gibbs from being an automatic choice as the third best spinner of all time is the reason that he wasn't as good in the fourth innings as most spinners usually are. But Hugh Tayfield is fun. He averages 43 in the first innings, and that falls off a cliff to 16.69 in the second. We can only assume that he bowled on a lot of wet wickets, which really helped his kind of finger spinner. In fact, he has the lowest second inning average amongst any bowler here. And then he reaches some normalcy in the third and the fourth. I mean, I've honestly never seen a spinner be a second innings destroyer like Tayfield. That is not where you are supposed to be a defeater of worlds as a tweaker. But what about Bishan Singh Bedi, whose first 3 innings are over 31? And in the fourth, he's a demon. He's probably the best fourth innings bowler we have ever seen in Test match cricket. And those numbers even hold up when he bowls in Australia. Murali and Laker are the only two spinners to average under 20 at home and under 30 away. There's a cluster of bowlers with low differential in their home and away averages: Warne, Grimmett, Underwood and Tayfield. And we have the UAE as home games for the Pakistani spinners. And other neutral games have been considered as away games for the purpose of this. Syed Ajmal and Saqlain Mushtaq are the two Pakistani spinners to average below 30 on the road. And we've decided to take the mean of home and away averages here. And what that gives us is both of them equal weighting. This, to a certain degree, eliminates bowlers who might have had a lot of home or away game and puts them on a bit of an equal footing. Once we do this, Jim Laker still has the lowest average, but it's slightly higher than his overall mark. And that is exactly what we want. Murali still remains at second, but we do see Ashwin's average being higher than his overall mark here. This gives us a better idea of what Ashwin's record might have been if he didn't play the majority of his games at home. And Abdul Qadir really suffers here due to his high away average. 8 spinners have a positive home-away differential, with Mushtaq Ahmad being the only Asian spinner in that list, because most spinners who are not from Asia, when they come to Asia, are going to have much better numbers. You can see Richie Beno and Abdul Qadir at either ends of the spectrum here. Amongst the Asian spinners, Murali is a clear standout in both centre, so South Africa, England, New Zealand, Australia, and Asia. Jadeja and Ashwin average more than 35 in centre. Prasanna, Bedi and Chandrasekhar do not have a lot of difference in their average. On the other hand, Mushtaq Ahmad has a better average in centre than in Asia, perhaps because of the bounce and overspin he would often get. And when we have a look at the non-Asian spinners, Warne is obviously great at both. And Lyon has a similar average as well. Underwood also has a low differential between both conditions. Benno, Swan, Vittori, Gibbs and Ramadan all average lower in Asia than in Senna, and Locke averages about 10 less in Senna due to his incredible record at home on English wickets. But Murali is the best Asian spinner in Senna countries. He takes the most wickets per match while averaging better than anyone else on this list, though that is partly helped by not having to bowl that much in Australia. 3 spinners take more than 4 wickets per match here: Murali, Mushtaq and Kumble. 3 of the famous Indian spin quartet bowl very well in these conditions, averaging around 30 while taking more than 3.5 wickets per test. But we also, of course, need to account for the pitches. So we have a metric called match factor, which is the ratio of the combined average of the other spinners compared to the spinner that we're looking at in that game. So if in a test match a player has an average of 30 while the rest of the spinners average 45, the match factor is then 1.5. So higher is better, unlike kind of all other bowling stats, I suppose. Shakib Al Hassan looks great here, but it's only from 8 test matches, so a very small sample size. Mushtaq Ahmad has the second best match factor of all the spinners in these conditions, and he has 3 times the wickets that Shakib has. Murali's match factor of 1.25 is commendable when you consider that he also has the most wickets ever. Harass's match factor is above 1, and he's around the likes of Ashwin, Jadeja and Mankad on this graph. But here's my favourite one, who I believe was Bumble's choice as the 3rd best spinner of all time. Abdul Qadir averaged almost 50 in these matches and is still slightly above Kumble on match factor. And that is because he played in matches where other spinners averaged nearly 70. But it's also partly down to the fact that when he played, it was probably the worst era for spin ever. That's because the West Indies had basically ended spin bowling. Also, looking at the wickets he played on, he probably should have become friends with more curators. We see Kumble as an outlier despite his average of 37. However, his record looks a lot better in comparison compared to the other spinners in those matches. He averages 40% less than them, and along with Murali and Mushtaq Ahmad, he's the only bowler who takes more than 4 wickets per test in these countries. And what about the other Indian spinners? Harbhajan Singh and Ravi Shastri have a match factor of around 1.2, which is actually pretty good. Ashwin is at 1.09 and Jadeja is at 1.04. We also see Bedi, Chandrasekhar Prasanna and Nadkarni in a cluster with a similar kind of match factor of between 1 to 1.1. In terms of relative performances, most Pakistani spinners do not average better than the other tweakers in those matches. Iqbal Qasim is exactly 1, and Ajmal basically runs into Swan in England. Even though Yasir Shah has a really high average, his match factor is actually close to 1, which suggests that other spinners also didn't have a great average in the games that he played. Now, we've talked about the Senna countries and the Asian countries, but the one region we skipped is the West Indies, who have been bad or unbeatable at various points in their history. And also, they have one of the most confusing legacies when it comes to spin, because some of their wickets really spin, and some of their wickets really don't spin. You could make a case that the West Indies is sometimes like Australia, and sometimes like Sri Lanka. And on both extremes here, we have Ajmal and Harath. Then the reason is the same. They only played 2 tests, so we can throw them away. Maharaj, Swan, Ashwin and Jadeja all have great numbers, but we have to note that they did this against incredibly poor West Indies batting lineups. If we take a look at the slightly older guys, like the Spin Quartet and Qadir and Underwood, they did bowl against what we might call the mighty West Indies team. Or at least for a reasonable part of their career, they would have gone up against Viv Richards, Clive Lloyd, Kalaturan, Greenwich and Haynes. And amongst everyone here who does the best, it's Chandrasekhar. He had high wickets per match at 5.25 at a respectable average of 31. Bedi's marks overall are slightly worse. But we have to mention that Chandra took all of his wickets in 1976 before the West Indies team became the world beaters, although their batting was already pretty damn good. Naturally, the next question would be to find out the best visiting spinners in Asia. Lyon has the most victims, while Benno takes the most number of wickets per match and has the best average. He was a slightly faster wrist spinner, and that obviously helped him over there. Swan is only second to Benno in terms of wickets per game. Underwood has a similar average, but 2.3 wickets less than Swanee. Gibbs also averages under 25, but under 4 wickets per game, but was probably unhittable. And Warne has a very good record, despite the fact that he struggled in India due to great batters, flat wickets, and his own lack of pace. But Benno remains an outlier. He has the 3rd best match factor of any spinner here. Gibbs averaged 59% better than the rest of the spinners in Asia. Fred Titmus had the highest match factor, although Titmus did not play a lot of games. Warne's numbers hold up well over a very large sample size. Underwood and Swan also perform well. And yes, I think it's fair to expect better numbers from a player of Lions caliber. And he has a match factor of 0.94, meaning he was 6% worse than the spinners he went up against in those games. But we also know that over the years he's actually worked out how to bowl in Asia quite well, and so he has done better on recent tours. Also, a big part of his reputation comes from the fact he bowls so much, and he bowls so much on wickets that are not at all set up for Nathan Lyon. And that's one of the first things you notice here. Even though Lyon's average at home is above 30, the rest of the spinners average more than twice that in those games. Yes, it's his home, but just being twice as good as anyone else is obscene. And like most things we look at, Murali clearly stands out in both of these metrics. Jadeja and Ashwin perhaps formed the best spin bowling duo ever in their conditions. Even though their relative numbers get affected by each other being that good, they are so much better than the touring spinners. Plus, Ashwin has done it over a massive sample size, and he has the second most wickets ever at home, and the point about Ashwin and Jadeja affecting each other's numbers also holds true for Bedi, Chandra, Prasanna and Venkat. We also see Kumble and Harath around that same cluster. Warne, Underwood, Swan, McGill and Gibbs also have a match factor well above 1.5 at home. Laker is below that mark, but he has the best bowling average by spinner at home. Locke also averages under 20, but the other spinners actually hold up pretty well in those games. And it is worth noting that we spoke about Grimmett, Tayfield and Laker at the start, but we haven't mentioned them all that much since. That's because they never actually played games in Asia. They're still great, so it is important to evaluate their career records kind of separately from the rest. Grimmett, Laker and Tayfield all average above 30 against England, West Indies and Australia respectively, but it is still worth noting they took more than 4 wickets per test against those opponents. Laker did not play a lot against India and Pakistan, but he averaged under 20 and took more than 4 wickets per game against Australia, South Africa and New Zealand. Tayfield took most of his wickets against England and averaged 22.1 at 5 per match. He is also one of the bowlers who went at less than 2 runs and over for his entire career. Grimmett was simply incredible against South Africa and the West Indies, with 7.7 and 6.6 wickets per match, respectively. Laker averaged 18 in England, 21 in Australia, 29 in South Africa, and 32 in the West Indies. However, he had low wickets per match when he was playing in South Africa. Tayfield has great numbers in New Zealand, but from only 2 games. Although he averages the most in Australia, finger spinners beware! He also took 6 wickets per test there, which seems pretty good. At home, he took more than 4 wickets per match at an average of 26, and he was very decent in England. Grimmett was incredible in South Africa. He averaged under 15 and took just under 9 wickets per match. He also took more than 5 per game in Australia and England and didn't average above 30 anywhere. In terms of relative numbers, Laker was at his best in England, but he did well in Australia and the West Indies also. But in South Africa, other spinners beasted him. Tayfield's match factor in New Zealand is an outlier, but from that small sample size. He was 52% better than other spinners in Australia, which I think gives you better context for how his average of 30 might not sound great, but actually was pretty good. He performs better than the rest of the spinners in England and at home too. And Grimmett's best match factor is obviously South Africa, where he is more than 2 times better than the rest of the spinners. But he also did really well in England and was even better in Australia. Then you have Hugh Trumbull, Bill O'Reilly and Headley Verity. All incredible spinners, but they didn't take 150 wickets, which was the cutoff for our analysis. However, Trumbull was the highest wicket-taking bowler of his generation, 41 ahead of Monty Noble. And there is no doubt he was a great of his era, but his average is not extraordinary for someone who bowled so much in the 1890s, even if it might seem like it now. O'Reilly and Verity played between the 2 world wars, and they were the top wicket-takers of their era. Verity might have been the best wet wicket bowler ever, so he did struggle in Australia and South Africa, but he cleaned up on a tour of India. Grimmett's case is often weakened by the fact that those who saw both always said that Tiger Bill O'Reilly was better, faster and more ruthless than him. Unfortunately, a lot of players lost their career in World War II, like O'Reilly. But in Verity's case, he lost his life to World War II. There's a whole host of other interesting spinners as well, like Johnny Briggs and Bobby Peel. Johnny Wardle bowled left-arm finger spin as well as left-arm wrist spin, and Colin Blythe was a left-arm finger spinner very early on in cricket. And to be honest, all of these players need to be mentioned. There's been a lot of fantastic spinners, and this is not an easy one to answer. But it's hard to compare all those bowlers to other players who just have much more well-rounded resumes. And when it comes down to it, the third best spinner of all time completely depends on the way that you look at the game. Ashwin has an outstanding record at home and is a great matchup option outside of Asia. Whereas Lyon is an off spinner who is superb at home, but does not quite cash in a way how Australia would like him to. But let's not forget about Kimber, who did not have the luxury of the pace attacks that those two had and bowled on incredibly flat pitches. And Kimber also took 4 wickets a game outside of spin wickets. And that's a hell of a resume for someone who is seen as an Asian specialist. Lance Gibbs is clearly the greatest spinner of all time from the West Indies, and he was really high up in terms of usage and performed well across lots of different conditions. And when it came down to it, I found it really hard to separate Grimmett, Tayfield and Laker in terms of numbers. And although the anecdotal evidence was very different for all of them, they're all rated incredibly high. For me though, the final choice is probably going to go down to Ashwin versus Kimber, with Laker and Grimmett just behind. Which, and funnily enough, when we asked our Discord channel, is basically how they looked at it as well. I personally just came down to Ashwin versus Kimber. I've watched both men and I think Ashwin was a better bowler. However, his average is largely down to the home pitches he played on and the away ones he missed. But how do you hold it against the fact that his career happened to overlap with a once in 50 years all-rounder named Ravi Jadeja? On the other side, Kimber had to bowl on all of those sucky wickets, home and away, and he was made to toil for his victims in a way that few bowlers ever have before or since. His overall numbers are not always great, but the more you start to slice up his career, the quicker you can make his case. Oh, and of course there is still one thing to remember here. Ashwin is still playing, and I have Kimber as my third best spinner ever right now. But if Ashwin plays for 5 more years, or 3 more years, and crucially if Jadeja retires, he's going to get a lot more opportunities to change his record. But right now I have Kimber after this very deep dive. But if you ask me tomorrow, it could still be Ashwin. And I could give great arguments for Laker, Grimmett, Tiger Bill O'Reilly, I don't know, Bisham Beatty, Lance Gibbs. There's a lot of fantastic spinners. But the more I think about it, maybe the third greatest test spinner was really the friends we made along the way. I have a book out with Abhishek Mukherjee, and it is called Overthrowing Cricket's Empire. And it's about the stories of how each team beat England for the first time. We go all the way back to the demon Fred Spofforth getting annoyed at W.G. Grace for acting a little bit like Alex Carey. And then we come all the way to present times with Rashid Khan's England's redemption. We cover every single team to beat England in a major international, but we also talk about the incredible stories, like the barefoot basher from Fiji that almost played for New Zealand. In fact, this book is full of tales like that, like how Pakistan lost a top batter after he was on the run from an angry husband of a movie star he was having an affair with, and also how one future captain of his nation realised he might have to go out and bat at Lords and that he didn't own his own pads. Cricket was used as a tool by the empire, but what happens when those nations grow up and get good at it? Find Overthrowing Cricket's Empire on Amazon today.